Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm glad you're joining us today. If you are, my thanks to Jeffrey and Boguslav for jumping in here again. I always appreciate that greatly. Thank you, gentlemen. Today's great because this is the 11th week we've been doing this. Believe it or not, I can't believe it. It's May 27th, 2023. And we're on the final chapter of this wonderful book. At least I think it's a wonderful book. Very insightful, very thought-provoking. And this chapter is this is called Living with Death, the 11th chapter. And this is the kind of overarching some ideas to encapsulate. How do we deal with this? How do we deal that we're born, we're given a name, we have this incredible desire and drive to live and do these wonderful things, and yet to know we're going to die, to paraphrase Becker. How do we deal with that? And the authors in the book give us some really good insight into some things that we can do. And I'm also going to share some of my ideas of what I've done and how I've been looking at this for, I guess I read Becker 5 years ago or so. And so I've been looking at this fairly tightly for about 5 years. My Chemical Pictures book in 2019, I'd read Becker in 2018, or maybe a little before that. I can't really remember. And I included some thoughts in the Ghost Dance material that I did, the massacre sites here in Colorado. And I included a little bit of thought of Becker, but nothing like I've done in the last couple of years. I've really, what they say, deep diving into this stuff, which is really interesting for me from an artistic standpoint. So I'm going to share some of that. Hello, Thilo. Welcome, brother. Good to see you from Japan. And Mr. Fred Runkle from Washington State. I appreciate you jumping in here, Fred. Fred is foregoing a book thrift sale, and he could have been over there getting the good books early, but he decided to join us. So thanks, Fred. I hope Beth is with us. I chat with Beth often. She's in Glastonbury, UK, I believe, and everyone else or anyone else joining us. I appreciate it whenever you're watching this. So let's get on with this. I'm going to jump right in here. I'm going to show you a couple of things, share a couple of things with you about this chapter and some of the ideas that I have on it. Slideshow, go. So this is what we're dealing with today, May 27th. They're on Woman at the Core, the role of death in life, episode 11, chapter 11, the final one, Living with Death. And in this chapter, we're going to the sub-chapters. We're going to talk about if I should wait before I die, kind of an interesting little sub-chapter title. The Epicurean cure, an interesting take on some a Greek thinker back in the, I'm sure you've heard of Epicure. The persistence of the terror of death, coming to terms with death, identifying with the continuity of life, transience versus transcendence, cultural worldviews, the rock and the hard place. That is a huge one for me. This is one of the things I really identified. Last year, I wrote an essay on my blog. I put it in the YouTube chat, The Rock and the Hard Place Theory, and it's a link to my blog. It's October 13th, 2022 is when I wrote it. If you're interested, after we read this, if you're interested or bookmark it or whatever, go and check that out. It's Greenberg talks about, this is a wonderful theory. This explains my main thesis, my main thrust of doing this work is embedded into that, the rock and the hard place theory, the cultural worldviews. And then some final thoughts on finality, which is kind of interesting there. I want to share a couple of quotes before we read this. This is from Irving Yalom. You probably recognize the name. He's featured in this book, very prominent thinker, psychologist, philosopher type. It says, the more unlived your life, the greater your death anxiety. The more you fail to experience your life fully, the more you will fear death. That's what's kind of coming to a head here as we talk about some of the solutions. The biggest problem with facing the knowledge of our mortality, knowing that we're going to die and this will to live, is not coming to terms with it, is not facing it front on. Soren Kierkegaard called it going to the school of anxiety. Now, we can't live in that space all the time, but we can come to terms in some way. We'll never fully get rid of death anxiety. It's built into us. It's like gravity. There's just no way we can fully rid ourselves from it. But we can turn it around, and this is what you'll see in this chapter. We can, if we try, and we're very, if we self-examine, if we're critically think, if we spend time to really think about these ideas, we can turn it into a very positive, very life-affirming ideas. I know people think this is all gloom and doom, and you're always talking about death, blah, 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 but not really. And I love this one by Charles Dickens. No one is useless in this world who lightens the burdens of another. That's a wonderful theme, a wonderful idea, because when we talk about coming to terms and some of the final thoughts on finality that the authors write about, there's a great quote. We're going to come back to this. I pulled this out of the book. We're going to come back to this, these questions. What is the best illusion to live with? Is there one? Do you live in the rock space or the hard space? How do you propose we come to terms with death? And then finally, this right out of the worm that we're going to read today on page 177, this is what we're talking about, promoting, really having our lives infused with courage, compassion, concern for future generations. In other words, coming to terms with death through a more positive outlook kind of thing. So we'll come back to that at the end here. Let's jump right in and start reading this. This is not a very long chapter, so it won't take us a tremendous amount of time, but we'll have time to discuss it. So here it is, chapter 11, Living with Death. This poem, or I don't know if you want to call it a poem, but this passage by Walt Whitman from Life and Death, this is a little bit abstract for people when you read it. We'll just read it and talk about it for a second. The two old, simple problems ever intertwined, close home, elusive, present, baffled, grappled, by each successive age insoluble, passed on to ours today, and we pass on the same. Now, he never addresses exactly what he's talking about there, but what he's really grappling with here is the two big problems that are intertwined. And my conclusion is he's talking about life and death, and how there's difficulty on how to deal with that. So a lot of terror management theorists, a lot of thinkers about death anxiety and the denial of death, Becker often talks about it in his book, The Denial of Death. It's not only the knowledge of our mortality or the fear of our death, not the actual death, but the impermanence and insignificance after we die, rotten, being forgotten, that kind of thing. That is terrifying to us when we peel the onion away and we get right down to it. That is absolutely terrifying to us. But what that also does is it makes us stop living in a lot of ways. That other quote I read from Yalom, that's what he's talking about. The fear of death will create a fear of living. And I think this is what Whitman, you can interpret it how you want, but I think this is what Whitman is talking about here. But anyway, it's a little abstract, so I wanted to address that. At the outset of our track, we propose that examining history, the sciences, and the humanities, findings from the laboratory experiments, and people's day-to-day struggles would expose death as the worm at the core of the human experience. Our exploration of death's place in the human psyche has taken us from ancient burial sites to futuristic cryogenic labs, from the slopes of Kilimanjaro to a school cafeteria in San Francisco, from the mind of a typical 3-year-old to that of a florid schizophrenic. Let's briefly recap what we've learned and then consider how, as individuals and societies, we might all arrive at better ways to deal with death. We began with Ernest Becker, Although the idea that humans dread death and are preoccupied with transcending it has been floating around since antiquity in both religious and philosophical thought, Becker seized readers by the throat in 1973 with his powerful articulation of this notion in The Denial of Death. This book certainly made a substantial splash in its day, bringing death into public discourse, winning a Pulitzer Prize, making a cameo in Annie Hall. If you haven't seen that, you should, and impacting the lives of many readers, including the young Bill Clinton. It's said that Bill Clinton has The Denial of Death in the top 10 of his favorite books. But for the most part, the wave rapidly dissipated as Becker's analysis did not directly contribute to progress in any specific discipline. In a world where science dominates conversation in the streets and on the internet, in university classrooms and academic conferences, and in political summits and executive board meetings, the ideas lay dormant. And that's sad to me. I really, if I were to get to the core of what, no pun intended, but if I were to get to the core of what I am most interested in is sharing these ideas with people, one or two people, with the hopes that they share these ideas with another couple of people and try to, rather than a Barbie doll going viral, try to get some of these theories going viral kind of thing. When three young experimental social psychologists happened upon Becker's decade-old book, they were taken by the idea that the terror of death drove a great deal of human behavior. Energized to get the word out and hoping to launch a wave large enough to start irrigating the parched fields of social science, we encountered two frustrating, albeit opposite, reactions. Many of our fellow scientists argued that they do not think about death all that much, so it was inconceivable that death fears could pervade just about everything people think, feel, and do. Others were willing to grant in principle that the Grim Reaper weighs in on the scale of human affairs, but insisted that there was no way to confirm that notion empirically. And consequently, cogitations about mortal matters would never get beyond hipster party chatter. Once we formalized Becker's analysis of the human condition into terror management theory, we began fashioning experiments to test the many hypotheses that spilled readily out of the theory. Some 30 years and more than 1,500 studies later, and there's even more than that now, there is now overwhelming evidence confirming Becker's central claim that the awareness of death gives rise to potentially debilitating terror that humans manage by perceiving themselves to be significant contributors to an ongoing cultural drama. That is key right there. We found, as Becker posited, that self-esteem buffers anxiety in general. It buffers anxiety in general, and anxiety about death in particular. We discovered that subtle, even subliminal reminders of death increase devotions to one's cultural scheme of things, support for charismatic leaders, and confidence in the existence of God and belief in the efficacy of prayer. They amplify our disdain toward people who do not share our beliefs, even to the point of taking solace in their demise. They drive us to compulsively smoke, drink, eat, and shop. They make us uncomfortable with our bodies and our sexuality. They impel us to drive recklessly and fry ourselves in tanning booths to bolster our self-esteem. They magnify our phobias, obsessions, and social anxieties. Many of these findings confirmed very specific ideas that can be found verbatim in Becker's books, even one that seems at first outlandish, such as the link between sex and death. But it's one thing to propose such a link and quite another to demonstrate it empirically. And as research findings accumulated, they have led us and other investigators in a variety of surprising directions that even Becker and his predecessors had not anticipated, even beyond the domains we have explored in this book. Remember the first terror management experiment in Chapter 1? Municipal court judges had more punitive reactions to an alleged prostitute after thinking about their own mortality. This has some ominous implications for jurisprudence. Intimations of mortality, often prevalent in legal proceedings, decisively influence judicial outcomes independent of actual evidence. And this is especially true for capital punishment cases. Donald Judges, a great name for a lawyer, at the University of Arkansas School of Law argued that terror management may be the driving force behind capital punishment in both adjudicative and legislative settings. Motivated by an unconscious defense of one's worldview to ward off incipient death awareness. Indeed, a recent study found that during troubled times, when rates of homicide and violent crimes were high and death fears were likely to be aroused, death sentences and executions increased in conservative states, but decreased in liberal ones. Jeffrey Kirchmeier at the City University of New York School of Law concluded that judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys should be aware of terror management influences in deciding cases in order to seek justice and a fair death penalty system. See, right there is a great example of how real-world death anxiety affects something in our lives. So you have a judge or you have a prosecutor that's somehow reminded of their mortality and they're passing judgment or sentence on you. That could be really devastating. Reminders of death also abound in medical settings, likely affecting how healthcare providers diagnose and treat their patients. When non-Muslim American medical students reminded of their own death, inspected identical emergency room admittance forms for a Muslim or a Christian patient complaining of chest pain, they gave more serious cardiac risk estimates for a Christian and less serious estimates for a Muslim, suggesting that diagnostic biases could result if healthcare providers use their cultural identification to manage their own death anxiety. Medical students in another study reported how they would treat a patient with severe lung disease brought to the emergency room by his family in respiratory distress. Although the patient was supposedly lucid at the time of admission and was opposed to artificial means to keep him alive, those reminded of their own death were determined to extend his life as long as possible. Their treatment preferences were driven by their own existential concerns rather than the patient's wishes. Another big one. Finally, terror management research has also deepened our understanding of how people respond to intimations of mortality by demonstrating that proximal defenses are triggered by conscious thoughts of death, and distal defenses are instigated by death thoughts that occur outside awareness. As we saw in Chapter 9, this novel insight has a host of important implications for improving health-related decision-making. Terror management research continues around the globe and will hopefully serve to enhance our comprehension of the role of death in life for years to come. If I should wake before I die. One of our goals in writing this book was to help awaken us from all the dream of life we lead when we are totally immersed in our own cultural worldview. In other words, they wanted to make you aware and give us food for thought, and make us conscious of these theories in order to change our way of denying death and coming to terms with it. Austrian activist Gustav Klimt, I'm sure you guys, some of you know who he is, depicted a similar idea in his famous 1910 painting, Death and Life. Most people are generally asleep to the reality of death, but there is at least one young woman in the picture awake with her eyes open to it. But now that we're like the young woman with her eyes open to death, what can we do about it? I'll show you. I think that picture is down here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. Can you see the woman with her eyes open? All these people are asleep, and here's death, and here's the woman with her eyes open, just the one right there. That's what everyone here is. That she is symbolic of us, because we have read this book and we understand these theories now. So, with her eyes open to death, what can we do about it? In the beginning, according to the book of Genesis, God created Adam and Eve in his image and installed them as caretakers in the Garden of Eden. The beginning was a blissful time, and Eden was a perfect place. There was no death, no shame, no sin. Adam and Eve had carte blanche to sample all the abundant amenities in the garden, as long as they steered clear of the apples from the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. Things went swimmingly until the serpent tempted Eve to grab a bite of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, and she passed the apple on to Adam. God was not pleased. He expelled Adam and Eve from paradise and doomed them and us and their descendants and us, their descendants, to a life of work and pain as the prelude to death. From a biblical standpoint, the knowledge Adam and Eve gained by partaking of the apple made them mortal. From a scientific standpoint, the development of the human neocortex spawned symbolic thought, self-awareness, the capacity to reflect on the past and anticipate the future, and the knowledge of our own mortality. In this way, the fall of man, the allegorical foundation of Western religion, converges with contemporary science. With increasing knowledge came the awareness of death, and that changed everything. The knowledge of death, rather than death per se, is the worm at the core of the biblical apple. It is that knowledge that made us human and initiated our unrelenting quest for immortality, a quest that profoundly influenced the course of human history and persists to this day. Thousands of years ago, Greek philosopher Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, argued that unacknowledged death fears and the problems that arise from them are defining characteristics of our species. In the first century BC, Epicurus's follower, Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius, 94 to 51 BC, explained in On the Nature of Things that death fears make people overly dependent on religious and secular authorities and lead them to adhere to superstitious and irrational beliefs instead of relying on their own experience and critical judgment. Moreover, to avoid self-awareness and the coincident recognition of their finitude, people squander their lives in trivial pursuits or are obsessed with greedily accumulating money and stuff or blindly lusting for power and honor. Such insatiable desires, Lucretius contended, make humans prone to unhappiness and profoundly dangerous. Epicurus and Lucretius were both brilliant and prescient. They described the universe as an infinite number of atoms bounding about in space, coming together and breaking apart incessantly without plan or purpose, sometimes veering in unpredictable directions, yielding unexpected outcomes. This vision anticipated the foundation of modern physical science, Darwin's theory of evolution and Einstein's theory of relativity. And their account of humans is powerfully motivated by efforts to transcend death, anticipated the existential foundation of modern psychological science that Ernest Becker articulated, that terror management research has verified. How then can we learn to deal with our inevitable mortality in a way that does not provoke personal distress and hatred and killing of others? How can we, in short, learn to live better with death? The Epicurean cure. For Epicureans, including Lucretius, the way out of this psychological conundrum was straightforward. First, we must become aware of our fear of death. Then we must recognize that it is irrational to be afraid of death. After all, the Epicureans argued, bad things can only happen to those capable of sensation. Dead people are devoid of all sensations, just as we all were before we were conceived. Being dead is thus no different from never having existed. No one is terrified of the time before they were born, so why fret about death, since it is precisely the same insensate state that prevailed for eons before time. Once we realize this, death anxiety will be eliminated, and we will no longer yearn for immortality. This, Epicurus proposed, will in turn make the mortality of life more enjoyable. Indeed, looked at it in a certain way, our awareness of death yields a keener appreciation for life. The lilies of the field and the birds in the sky are spared our existential excruciations. Yet they are also denied the unique awe and delight of finite self-reflective creatures. It is from some obscure recognition of the fact of death, wrote Scottish essayist Alexander Smith in 1863, that life draws its final sweetness. As children, we have hours of fleeting fun that Smith likened to the glee of frolicking animals. But as adults, we have serious joy, which looks before and after and takes in both this world and the next. We know, if only vaguely and incoherently, that our finest and most memorable experiences may never, and indeed ultimately will never, happen again. That is why we cherish them so. Moreover, add contemporary thinkers such as Martha Nussbaum, Tyler Volk, and Stephen Cave. Death is necessary for life to go on. Without it, humankind would be unable to adapt to fluctuating environmental conditions. If nobody died, there would be no room for new humans to provide genetic variation, original discoveries, technological innovations, and artistic creations. Human biological and cultural evolution would come to a grinding halt. Each of us must die to ensure that future generations may grow, Lucretius wrote. They too, having lived out their lives, will follow you. Generations before this perished just like you and will perish again. Thus, one thing will never stop arising from another. Life is nobody's private property, but it is everyone's to use. In an Epicurean universe, then, God would tell Adam and Eve about Lucretius's On the Nature of Things in the Garden of Eden instead of assuming they'd prefer to remain oblivious to the reality of the human condition. And Adam and Eve would be delighted to reside in their earthly paradise, even as temporary inhabitants who leave no footprints in the sands of time. The persistence of the terror of death. These are cogent arguments worthy of serious consideration. However, Epicurean efforts to eliminate death anxiety on rational grounds have been spectacularly unsuccessful to date. People have not changed all that much in the last 3,000 years. They remain steadfastly disinclined to die and passionately devoted to acquiring literal and symbolic immortality. Death, the undiscovered country, as Hamlet portrayed it, from which no traveler returns, is for self-conscious creatures too terrifying to stop worrying about. Death anxiety may not be rational, but neither are we. We are animals, and like all living creatures, we are biologically predisposed to resist premature termination. Any life form that readily acquiesced to death would be eradicated from the gene pool in exceedingly short order. We have a variety of bodily systems that keep us going, including a limbic system that generates terror when our existence is threatened. And we need this fear to survive in a dangerous world. At the same time, our cerebral cortex makes us aware of our perpetual vulnerability and inevitable mortality. We must therefore continually manage the potential to experience that terror. If death anxiety cannot be summarily deposed, how about banishing death itself? If we didn't die, presumably there would be nothing to worry about. Or would there? Even the modern immortalists like Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil figure out how to extend life indefinitely or replace body parts with robotic components or upload themselves onto flash drives and other computer clouds, they will never be able to completely eliminate random incidents and accidents that have irrevocable and fatal consequences. Now think about this. This is very interesting. Perishing in a plane crash is tragic today because decades might be lost from one's life. But being incinerated in an aerial mishap would be even more ominous for beings with a vast or infinite lifespan. Think about that, right? We know we have, or hope we have 70, 80 years, something like that. What if you had infinite lifespan? How much more ominous for those people if that were true. Vast or infinite lifespan, because of the exponentially greater amount of time lost. Ironically, then, death anxiety might not be eliminated and could even be heightened in a world where death was not inevitable. That's food for thought. So if banishing death anxiety or death itself is likely impossible and perhaps not even desirable, what else can be done? Walt Whitman was probably right in his poetic proposition that life and death are age-old problems that, unlike curing polio or getting a rocket ship to the moon, have no clear solution, and that people of each generation must grapple with them in light of current knowledge, historical conditions, and personal experiences. But from a terror management perspective, it seems to us that there are two viable approaches to foster better living with death. First, we can become more aware and accepting of the reality of our mortality. Second, we can strengthen our sense of death transcendence in non-destructive ways. Coming to terms with death. In his notebooks, Albert Camus wrote, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." Since antiquity, theologians and philosophers, and more recently psychologists, have emphasized the importance of accepting our mortality as a means to diminish the destructive effects of unconscious death fears and to enhance appreciation of everyday life. That is so true. Let's say you are today and right now attempting to confront the raw fact that your wonderful, soft body, the happy one that played as a child, the youth that enjoyed athletics and sex, the adult that perhaps produced children, the same body that holds your miraculous brain that has imparted so many ideas, and the beating heart that has loved so much and so many is going to go the ignominious way of all other animals and humans that have existed before you. It's sad and unwelcome news. How do you begin to face that cold reality? Many approaches to facing death head-on have been practiced in different times and places. Medieval monks kept a human skull on their desk. Tibetan lamas used a ceremonial bowl made from a human skull to remind them of the impermanence of life. Eastern and Western sages slept near or in their coffins for the same purpose. How-to manuals such as the Bardo Thodol, currently popularized as a Tibetan book of living and dying, and Artis Moriendi, The Art of Dying Well, have also been commonly employed. In his famous 1580 essay, that to study philosophy is to learn to die, that's from a Socrates quote, Michel de Montaigne, enthusiastic admirer of Lucretius, laid out his approach to coming to terms with death. For Montaigne, death is an adversary who cannot be evaded and must be confronted. Let us learn bravely to stand our ground and fight him, and to begin to deprive him of the greatest advantage he has over us. Let us take away quite contrary to the common course. Let us disarm him of his novelty and strangeness. Let us converse and be familiar with him, and have nothing so frequent in our thoughts as death. Upon all occasions, represent him to our imagination in his every shape, at the stumbling of a horse, at the falling of a tile, at the least prick with a pin. Let us presently consider and say to ourselves, well, and what if it had been death itself? And thereupon, let us encourage and fortify ourselves. Let us evermore, amidst our jollity and feasting, set the remembrance of our frail condition before our eyes, never suffering ourselves to be so far transported with our delights, but that we have some intervals of reflecting upon and considering how many several ways this jollity of ours tends to death, and with how many dangers it threatens it. That's really good. Excellent. Through diligent efforts to become familiar with the prospect and inevitable fact of dying, one ideally becomes psychologically fortified to the point where, as Montaigne put it, I am at all hours as well prepared as I am ever like to be, and death, whenever he shall come, can bring nothing along with him I did not expect long before. Boy, that dude was really coming to terms with it, right? Thus encouraged, Montaigne can agree with Lucretius's counsel. Why not depart from life as a sated guest from a feast? That is a good one as well. A few centuries after Montaigne, Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard recommended enrolling in the school of anxiety as the best way to come to terms with death. He proposed allowing the unbridled fear of death to enter consciousness to the point where all culturally constructed beliefs, including one's own personal identity, are momentarily shattered. At this extremely tenuous moment, one can then experience a, quote, leap of faith, in Kierkegaard's case, into Christianity. Graduating from the school of anxiety wouldn't completely eliminate death anxiety. Rather, facing the undistorted, undenied fact of death becomes a spur toward a deeper appreciation of life and greater compassion for fellow humans. That is powerful right there. That is a wonderful explanation of coming to terms and the results. For some philosophers and theologians after Kierkegaard, all of the world's religions can serve the same transformative function. Other existential thinkers insist that a deep confrontation with one's own mortality requires no form of religious allegiance. Martin Heidegger argued that every individual must recognize that she or he is a being toward death. And because everyone dies his or her own death, authentic living by courageous awareness and acceptance of death is of necessity a personal undertaking. So it's been phrased a leap of faith for Kierkegaard into religion and a leap of faith to life for Heidegger, those kind of secular and religious ideas. Such openness to a sustained contemplation of death may be easier in societies deeply steeped in religious concept of soul and afterlife than in more secular settings. Americans are particularly prone to simply avoiding thinking about death and dealing with the dying. And our affluence and technology make it easier for us to keep intimations of mortality at bay. Yet there are at least glimmers of more openness to coming to terms with death in Western cultures. In 1980, Derek Humphrey founded the Hemlock Society to lobby for laws that support a person's right to a peaceful, dignified death. In 2004, Swiss sociologist Bernard Cretas organized Mortal Cafes in Switzerland, Belgium, and France, casual gatherings held in coffee shops and restaurants at which individuals talk about death in a comfortable environment hosted by social workers and chaplains. John Underwood exported the Death Cafe to England and the United States in 2011. Participants are people who definitely want to talk about death, Underwood observed. For nearly all of them, engaging with dying, even for a short time, is a positive and life-enhancing process. Identifying with the continuity of life, transience versus transcendent versus transcendence. Making peace with one's death is surely a worthy goal with many psychological and social benefits. We humans are, however, not psychologically equipped to fully acquire such equanimity without an enduring sense of significance that extends beyond our own individual existence. In Broken Connection on Death and Continuity of Life, Robert J. Lifton described 5 core modes of death transcendence, some of which we have already considered in previous chapters on literal and symbolic immortality. Biosocial transcendence is derived from the literal connection to future generations by passing on one's genes history, values, and positions, or by identification with an ancestral line or ethnic or national identity that perseveres indefinitely. The theological mode entails faith in a soul and the possibility of literal immortality. It can also be a more symbolic sense of spiritual connection to an ongoing life force. Creative transcendence is obtained by contributing to future generations through innovations and teaching in art, science, and technology. Natural transcendence is identifying with all life, nature, or even the universe. This is ultimately how Charles Lindbergh found his peace. Recall that Lindbergh was consumed by his fear of death and spent most of his life in urgent pursuit of literal immortality. However, he had a change of heart on a visit to Africa and embraced natural immortality. When I watched wild animals of an African plain, my civilized values give way to a timeless vision in which life embraces the necessity of death. I see individual animals as mortal manifestations of immortal life streams. In death, then, is the eternal life which men have sought so blindly for centuries, not realizing that they had it as a birthright. Only by dying can we continue living. Finally, experiential transcendence is characterized by a sense of timelessness accompanied by a heightened sense of awe and wonder. Certain drugs can foster this kind of experience, as can meditation, various cultural rituals, and activities that provide a sense of flow or of losing oneself in contemplation and enjoyment. And such experiential states are most fulfilling when they occur in the context of one of the four other modes: playing with your children, engaging in spiritual rituals, throwing yourself into creative activity, being immersed in the natural world. And I'll say right now, when I get in my darkroom or studio, I don't have any clocks or anything. I don't wear a watch. I lose track, completely lose track of time. I don't know if I've been there an hour or 5 hours. That's what the flow, that's what he's talking about. I got a book called The Flow, the guy that kind of brought this all to head. And just like Lifton says, if you engage one of these, losing, the experiential in one of the others, that's one way. It's one way to come to terms and deal with death. You're participating in something transcendent, and you're also in awe and wonder and enjoying it. So it's a positive thing. Here we go. Cultural worldviews, the rock and the hard place. These modes of death transcendence are all grounded within a culturally constructed scheme of things, and some cultural worldviews guide us toward more constructive paths of transcendence than others. The question then becomes, as Ernest Becker put it, what is life enhancing illusion? In the classic 1941 horror film The Wolfman, Sir John Talbot, the Wolfman's father, describes two diverging approaches to life. For some people, life is very simple. They decide that this is good, that is bad, this is wrong, that's right. There's no right and wrong, no good and bad, no shadings and grays, all blacks and whites. Now, others of us find that good, bad, right, wrong are many-sided, complex things. We try to see every side, but the more we see, the less sure we are. That really sums up what we're going to read right now. These perspectives reflect two different kinds of worldviews. We call the one the rock and the other the hard place. The rock is a black and white scheme of things with explicit prescriptions for attaining literal and symbolic immortality. Unfortunately, many people who subscribe to the rock views fervently proclaim their beliefs to be absolute truth, and they insist that this can unambiguously differentiate between good and evil. Isms, fundamentalism, fascism, communism, and some forms of free market capitalism are rock views. According to Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, the fundamental problem with all isms is confusing their way with the way. It makes its myths and doctrines, its rights and laws into ultimates and persecutes those who do not subject themselves to it. Because rock worldview's clear and simple basis of meaning, self-worth, and immortality, they afford seductive psychological security for those who sustain faith in and feel valued within them. It was a great feeling, recalled former Hitler Youth member Harry Mettelmann. You felt you belonged to a great nation which found its feet again. Germany was in good, safe hands, and I was going to help and build a strong Germany. Heroically triumphing over evil is a great way to feel transcendent, and not just to Nazis. 19th century Lord Thomas Macaulay's well-known poem, From Lays of Ancient Rome, provides a classic example of such sentiment. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? Such gritty acknowledgement of our mortal fate has its appeal, but serving the ashes of ancestors and the temples of one's deities has perhaps led to more atrocities and killing than all other human motives combined. Why? Because the rock-type worldview tends to foster an us versus them tribal mentality that, as we have seen, breeds hatred and inflames intergroup conflicts. The alternative to rock worldviews is the hard place, conceptions of life that accept ambiguity and acknowledge that all beliefs are held with some measure of uncertainty. Hard place worldviews are malleable. Although adherents of the hard place takes their beliefs and values seriously, they are open to other ideas and refuse to claim sole ownership of the truth. They recognize that right and wrong and good and evil cannot always be disentangled. Consequently, they tend to be more tolerant of those who are different. The hard place means accepting that meaning and values are human creations. We each combine bits and pieces of our experiences with ideas and truths that we encounter to construct the reality in which we live and to become the kind of people who can make the best of that world. Perhaps there is an ultimate meaning and truth out there, but we can never fully grasp it because our awareness is constrained by the limits of our sense organs, our mental capacities, and our cultural blinders. This can be a disturbing realization, but it can be a liberating one as well. We do not have to accept the vision of reality that others have given us. Rather, we can strive to fashion meanings that maximize what we can get out of life and minimize the harm we do to others. Yet because meaning, self-worth, and immortality are never unambiguously certain, the hard place is a challenging place to be, psychologically speaking. Anxiety prevails. Death fears are manifested as vague and persistent dis-ease. Those living in the hard place often take refuge in self-medication through drugs and alcohol, self-indulgent through mass consumption and frivolous hedonism, and self-help through dubious books, new age gurus, and spiritual fads. So we are caught. The rock provides psychological security, but takes a terrible toll on those victimized by angry and self-righteous crusades to rid the world of evil. The hard place yields perhaps a more compassionate view of the world, but is less effective at buffering death anxiety. Somehow we need to fashion worldviews that yield psychological security, like the rock, but also promote tolerance and acceptance of ambiguity, like the hard place. Some final thoughts on finality. Come to terms with death. Really grasp that being mortal, while terrifying, can also make our life sublime by infusing us with courage, compassion, and concern for future generations. Seek enduring significance through your own combination of meanings and values, social connections, spirituality, personal accomplishments, identifications with nature, and momentary experiences of transcendence. promote cultural worldviews that provide such paths while encouraging tolerance of uncertainty and others who harbor different beliefs. Ancient wisdom fortified by contemporary science. But is there any chance that these ideas might alter the course of human affairs in the foreseeable future? Given that humans are transient creatures in a world that is all too often unpredictable, tragic, and grotesque, misery and strife will almost certainly persist, perhaps even to the point of human self-destruction. We cannot return to the Garden of Eden. We are never actually there, but the vast knowledge we have now about the pervasive influence of the awareness of death on human affairs may give us some purchase on how we can get better at living out our mortal lives. We believe that the ideas in this book provide a powerful way to understand yourself and the world you live in. And we hope that knowing how conscious and unconscious death thoughts instigate a host of unfortunate psychological and behavioral defenses enables you to monitor and alter such reactions. In turn, you can be more self-determined in the choices you make and the actions you take. Are you acting out of fear or being manipulated to do so by others? Are you driven by rigid defenses, or are you pursuing the goals you really hold dear in your life? In dealing with other people, are you considering how their efforts to manage the terror of death are affecting their actions and how your own defenses are influencing your reactions to them? By asking and answering these questions, we can perhaps enhance our own enjoyment of life, enrich the lives of those around us, and have a beneficial impact beyond it. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. That is a great food for thought. And let me just go back to this, my little question, my little thing here that I have pulled up. I want to just address a couple of these. And please, if you want to chime in or you have something to add, just throw it out there. So here's a couple of here's 3 questions to ask. What is the best illusion to live with? Is there one? The question of human life is this: on what level of illusion does one live? This question poses an absolutely new question for the science of mental health, namely, what is the best illusion under which to live, or what is the most legitimate foolishness? I think the whole question would be answered in terms of how much freedom, dignity, and hope a given illusion provides. Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death. So here's the bottom line. If you understand these theories and you understand how they work, you understand that we live in these cultural constructs. However you've been raised, whatever you believe in, whatever you lean on to bolster your self-esteem, those are all illusions. They're all man-made things, right? They're politics and social games and religions and everything we've constructed. People, human beings have constructed those to what? To buffer death anxiety. So Becker's asking the question, what is the best illusion to live under? Is it, and I know illusion sounds terrible, but that's basically what we're dealing with, human cultural constructs. What's the best one to live under? Is it religion? Is it politics? Is it, whatever you lean on? What is the best to lean against and get your self-esteem to buffer your death anxiety? That's the first question you can consider or think about. And the second one, do you live in the rock space or the hard space? So as we've seen, the rock space are these really black and white, absolute truths, worldviews. This is the way it is. There's and you see it. It's so prevalent today. The rock view here in the U.S., we have the political systems that I believe have one side's kind of the rock view, the other side's the hard place. The hard place, I would argue the hard place is the better place for me to be. The one thing I know for a fact, if I don't know anything else, is that I don't know a whole lot. So when I understand that I don't understand something, it makes it easier to have compassion. I don't understand the way they're thinking. I love how the authors talk about, do you consider someone that you're coming in, do you consider how they're managing their terror, their death anxiety, how you're managing your death anxiety? This is how these conflicts start. They're clashes of ways people deal with death anxiety, and they're usually culturally constructed. They're usually the out groups, the in groups, the out groups fighting. And so as you consider that rock space, absolute hard line, like they said, it gives them psychological security. That's why they're so, you see a rock place person and they're so convinced, they're absolutely convinced that they have the truth on whatever topic. And it's very difficult. You can't argue with them. You're not going to get through it. That's it. And the hard place person will say, well, maybe, maybe there is, some flexibility. I don't quite understand this, and, right and wrong, good and bad, all those things, they're very complex. They're very, always, there's something that always comes up with this. It's like, is lying bad? Yes, lying is bad. Okay. And so if you were in 1940 Germany and you were hiding Jewish people in your house and the Nazis came up and knocked on your door, do you have any Jews in here? What are you going to tell them? You say, no, I don't. So you're lying. You're in the hard place there. You're lying, but are you lying? Those are complex issues to deal with, right? You're saving lives. You're bettering those things. So that's the hard place view. The rock place would be you never lie. That's absolute. You don't lie, period. So these are very, very complex things to talk about. And if you have time, like I said, go check out my blog on the rock and the hard place theory. It's quite long, but it's interesting. I delve into it quite deeply there. And then finally, how do you propose we come to terms with death? I'm writing this book, as most of you know, and one of the big things, I don't want to call it a theory or a hypothesis or a theory or whatever, but I'm writing about, and I guess it is though, I'm writing about creativity and how I'm using my own creative life to buffer my own death anxiety, all while intellectualizing it, knowing that's what I'm doing, and also transcending symbolic immortality, transcendence in the time, all those things. So I'm writing about how art and a creative life is very important for some people, if you're going to lean on that, for some people to manage their death anxiety or their existential terror. William Faulkner from the Paris Review in 1956, he said, the aim of every artist is to arrest motion, which is life, by artificial means and to hold it fixed so that 100 years later, when a stranger looks at it, it moves again, since it is life. That's a classic example of symbolic immortality. So as we move through these ideas, we start to understand how tiny and how insignificant and how, come to terms with our finitude and our tininess and our puniness. And I'm with Becker and Solomon and Greenberg and Pyszczynski and all the great thinkers. I don't understand why these ideas aren't more prevalent. I don't understand why more people aren't interested in these ideas, right? If you start to consume these and you start understanding them, this stuff is pervasive. Every day you're living, psychologically speaking, you're living some part of this in your life. Death anxiety, the knowledge of your mortality is driving you, mostly unconsciously, but is driving you in your daily life. And if you start thinking about that, it can have profound effects for you and with you. It can have really positive ones. Appreciating life, life affirming, be in awe, nature transcendence, experiential transcendence, spending time creating art, spending time in nature, spending time with loved ones, whatever you're doing, those kinds of things. And if you're aware of it, it's super, super important. One more thing. We just talked about that. Come to terms with death, really grasping being mortal while terrifying, can make our life sublime by infusing it with courage, compassion, and concern for future generations. Seeking enduring significance through your own combination of meanings and values, social connections, spirituality, personal accomplishments, identifications with nature, and momentary experiences of transcendence, just like we talked about. Promote a cultural worldviews that provide such paths while encouraging tolerance of uncertainty and others who harbor different beliefs. Very, very profoundly important. And finally, everybody knows who Carl Sagan is. I always think of this. I always put myself in perspective when I start feeling like I'm, inflating my self-ego. I say, wait a minute, hold on. I come back down to earth. And Carl Sagan said, the earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. And when you look at it in that cosmic perspective, and Becker's really big on this as well, Carl Sagan is talking about terror management, death anxiety, denial of death. He's talking about putting ourselves in perspective. And once we get out, once we start losing, this is what I take away from the book. Once we get away from perspective, who we are, how we're dealing with this, what our unconscious psychological burdens are, the knowing that we're going to die, and such a pervasive and big effect on our lives. Once we get away from bearing that, denying death, pumping our egos up, thinking that everything we're doing is so important, we get riled up and we treat others poorly. We're the king or queen, poopah. We're so important. Once we do that, we're in a terrible situation because number one, we're borderline narcissistic, number one. Number two, we treat other people terribly when we're in that mode. When we're pumped up, we think we treat other people terribly in that mode. And there's plenty of wars and genocide throughout humanity to show that. And thirdly, when we lose that perspective, when we think we're the most important thing in the world, in the universe, we're in a dangerous position psychologically speaking there, because that's when we'll really suffer from the death anxiety. That's when it really creeps in and gets us. And if you look at if you review that mental health chapter 10, you'll review that. You'll see some of those mental health problems residing in this fear of death, and how those things creep up and how they pervasively take over our lives and put us in some bad situations. So dealing with our tininess, dealing with our futility, dealing with the meaninglessness, and then finding ways to transcend it. My big promotion now is using art, transcending these fears and issues around death with art, and being in awe, having humility, being grateful, having gratitude, all super important. And I think if you take nothing else away from this book, I hope you understand the human condition, the paradox of wanting to live, but knowing you're going to die, and the psychological conundrum that presents to the human animal. And that is the gist of it. And the fallout from that is existential terror, and how we manage that through the evolution of psychology. We have found ways through our culture to lean on these culturally constructed meaningless things to bolster our self-esteem so we don't fear death. That's the bottom line of it all. Now, there's a whole bunch of fallout from it beyond that, but that's what the gist of it is. Then the question is how, once you're aware of this, how are you going to manage it? And are you going to manage it in a way that's productive and meaningful and kind to other human beings? Or are you going to ignore it and let it consume you and other people and other cultures and all anything. Your fear is going to manifest malignantly onto other human beings. That's what happens, and we see it every day. We see it all the time. These are people with unmanaged death anxiety. That's basically what it is. So if nothing else, if you've never read a book, you've read a book now. There's a lot of Americans. Oh, I've never read a book. What? Oh my God. I hope that's not true. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Yeah, we can continue these discussions. Oh, Jeffrey, you think morals and ethics come into play to manage it? Absolutely. That's really what, going back to the hard place position. That's really what you're talking about. Ethics and morals. You could probably put some on the rock position too. If you're really hard line and strict, what are morals and ethics? Morals and ethics are treating other human beings fairly, justly, and kindly, basically. And so if you're fearing, if you have this terror bubbling out of you and you can't manage it, and you're feeling like you need to have this, in Solomon's words, this designated in-house inferior or the scapegoat to come down on to bolster your self-esteem. That's why we bully. That's why we treat other people badly. People that do that are bolstering their self-esteem. We need the other. We need, Becker thinks we'd create one. If we couldn't find one, would make something up, right? I think it was Virginia Woolf says, I don't like the color of your shirt or the shape of your nose, kind of thing. We would just make anything up. And so morals and ethics play a huge role, in my opinion, of being aware of everyone. If you think about this, everyone is in the same position that you're in. We're all facing death. I rewrote a little bit of my introduction yesterday of my book. And the first line of my introduction says, we are all in the process of dying. Everyone. Some are closer than others, but we are all in the process of dying. So I may die today, or I may die in 5 years or 10 years or tomorrow. We just don't know when we're going to die. So the question becomes, is that fear of death that's in our unconscious? We repress it through our culture. If we bring that forward and we say, how do we want to treat another human being? How do we want to be treated? How, ethics, morals, how do we manage that anxiety? Because that's really what why would you treat anybody well, or why would you be fair and just in anyone's cause? It's because you understand the same principles apply to them as they do you. We are all in this together. We are all going to die. We all face this terror. We all face this existential dread. We need meaning and significance in our life. We need to feel that we're a part of the world. How do we do that without being a narcissist and hurting other people? It's a very difficult place to be. And it takes a lot of deep thinking and a lot of very, introspection, like Socrates said, self-examination. How am I doing? The book says too, examine yourself. Why are you thinking about this person this way? Why do you feel that way? Why are you angry about this or offended by that? What is it that's doing that? And just be aware of it. It will start to change. It's profoundly changed my life. I mean, internally, it's really made me conscious of how I think about things, how I process ideas and people and groups, and I recognize myself feeling offended by something. Why am I offended by that? And then realizing that in my cultural worldview, that's what I've been taught is offensive, and it's not good. So that's the idea is if you can come to terms with those ideas of I'm registering that I'm offended, I'm upset, I'm mad, I'm sad, whatever it is, and then be able to parse that out and say, why is that? You start coming to a place where you're dealing with everything much better. On top of that, I've had so much time being up here on the mountain, and this is all I do all day, every day pretty much, other than me and Jeannie walking, and we're going to start our greenhouse now. But I make photographs and I think about this stuff. I read about this stuff. I'm constantly pondering it. So I've had a lot of time to digest this. I know it's a huge benefit, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that, because most people are consumed, and this isn't a mistake, that most people are consumed with their life, making a living, working a job. I got to do this, I got to do that. Those distractions are in place to keep you from thinking about death. So when I hear people talk about, oh, what are you talking? You're always talking about death. What do you mean by this? I never think about death. And I always tell them, yeah, it's you're perfectly bubble wrapped in your cultural construct. That's exactly how it's supposed to be, and it's working. But if you want to cut that bubble wrap off and you want to expose yourself, like Kierkegaard says, to the school of anxiety, and start thinking about these things, it's not a negative thing. You're not sitting around ruminating on death like you're having ideations of suicide. It's not that at all. You're trying to confront the reality of life and the paradoxical condition that you're in of wanting to survive but knowing you're going to die. You want to come to terms with, you're an animal and you hide these things. You know, you have a plate and a fork, and you have a bathroom, a rest room to go to. All these things that remind us that we're going to die and decay. If you want to come to terms with that, I think in the end, you'd be better facing those realities. And so do the authors of the Worm say this. Facing those realities will actually make you more compassionate. Like the Scottish essayist said, you know, the knowledge of our death makes us live a lot of, you know, if you think you've got forever, Heidegger said, you know, a great form of denial of death is saying you're going to be here tomorrow. That is not known. That is not known at all. So I appreciate everyone joining me for all this time, and joining me every week or whenever you're watching this. It doesn't matter if you watch it afterwards, but I appreciate that. And you know, if you ever want to delve into something, I'm going to continue on with my work. Check my blog out. I try to document everything on there. I'm going to work really hard over the summer to do this work. So I'm going to have an edition of both color and black and white or monochrome images in my book, both, you know, all various RA4 process, pop, you know, calotypes, wet, dry clothing, all those processes will be in my book. And I hopefully this year, this fall and winter, I'll be able to put the book all together finally with all the work and get all the writing kind of topped off and all that stuff. And next year, maybe I can release something that will encapsulate these ideas with a specific event in history where I live here and my own take on it. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a wannabe philosopher. I try to be a creative. I do love doing the work. I do love making the work, and it's interesting. Oh, Fred's got something here. This seems intimately connected to the observation of Jungian psychologist James Hollis. Yes, he wrote the book, The Middle Passage. And if you've never read that book by James Hollis, The Middle Passage, it's about the transition in life, you know, from your middle-aged crazy stuff. He debunks that, but psychologist James Hollis, that living well requires learning to tolerate AAA's anxiety, ambiguity, and ambivalence. Very well said. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Fred. That's wonderful. Absolutely. That is learning to tolerate. Yeah. I would even go a step further, and I'd say embrace if you can. I know it's a big leap, but very minimum, tolerate that, because if you don't tolerate it, you're going to bubble up with all that stuff. And that's, you know, if you start reading and looking around, these theories are embedded in so much out there. Film, movies, series, books. It's embedded, music, it's embedded everywhere, all kinds of artwork. People are using these ideas to buffer death anxiety, but that's a very good one. Thanks for sharing that, Fred. And James Hollis is a great author. I read that book years ago. It's a wonderful book. But so anyway, keep on going. If I get any wild hairs going here, I'll be sure to let you know. But for now, we're going to call that good. I'm going to try to work through the summer, like I said. Keep an eye on my blog. If you have any questions or comments, or you ever want to talk about this or address this, please write me. I love to converse. I talk to a couple of you out there now and again about it, but engage. I love it. Thank you so much for joining me. Jeffrey, Boguslav, many thanks. Many thanks. I appreciate you guys. It's wonderful to see your wonderful faces here when you can make it. And it's been a great time. So thanks for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it. Read it again, The Worm at the Core, on the Role of Death in Life. Read it again. Ponder these ideas. Try to implement them, especially creatively. I think you'll find a great resource for the work. So have a great weekend. Enjoy the day. And if you're in America, it's Memorial Day. How ironic. I wanted to mention this real quick. In America, this weekend is Memorial Day. It's a holiday that you're supposed to remember the dead and admire the dead. And you know what we do? We deny all that. We go get hot dogs and beer and go camping. So here we go, living in the denial of death. It's wonderful. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.